sharing time or
no? We no sharing here now.
Sharing. Fair enough.
Thanks, Ceann Corla. I am absolutely delighted to be here today and welcome the publication of the ISL Recognition Bill report, which has been brought here under the stewardship of our excellent chairperson, Deputy O'Quailon. I'd like to thank Senator Mark Daly, John Bosco Conema from Trinity College Centre for Deaf Studies, Eddie Redmond and Leanne Quigley of the Irish Deaf Society, and my good friend Micheál Kelleher, who is in the gallery and who has educated me about the situation facing deaf people in Ireland. In fact, one of the outstanding memories of the election campaign for me was when we were out canvassing and a woman answered the door and started signing, sort of probably saying, what are you going to do for the deaf community? And we were able to respond by Micheál immediately replying in sign language, which I would say was an absolute first for that woman in all of her elections. And that's the type of experience that deaf people should be experienced as a norm, not as an exceptional circumstance. And I am delighted in that sense that we are here. The report that the committee has commissioned highlights the extreme marginalisation and isolation of members of the deaf community and strongly recommends that we deal with this urgently through legislation. And it is shameful that the last Oireachtas didn't take the opportunity to recognise Irish Sign Language, and I really hope that we won't be making the same mistake. And even by being here today and discussing the committee's report, we're raising consciousness on the issues, because talking about people as customers is a wrong way of dealing with it. We're talking about citizens accessing public services as a right. And I think for the 5,000 deaf people in Ireland, the lack of language recognition has had the effect really of ingraining discrimination into everyday lives and has actually exacerbated isolation, correctly and sadly highlighted recently, as our chairperson said, in the deaths of the McCarthy brothers. We know the statistics. Deaf people have a low employment expectation, with only 40% in employment, most of those in low-paid employment, large numbers of our deaf community being excluded. We could spend a lot of time talking about the areas, and in fact the report, I think, highlights very well the need, for example, to have interpreters in judicial proceedings. This was highlighted for me earlier in the year when a court case in Donegal, where the judge actually decided to proceed in the absence of an interpreter, even though the defendant was deaf. I mean, we would not tolerate that from any person, from any jurisdiction, that a language interpreter would not be provided, and yet this barrier was allowed to prevail. And of course, those inequalities exist right throughout the state in terms of other service provision. And what we're trying to do in the report and focus in on, I think, is that the formal recognition of sign language, which is, as other deputies have said already, recognised in the north, should also be the case in the south, where there are actually more users. The example has been given of Finland, which has a deaf community roughly the size of Ireland, and they recognised the language in 1995. Now, I just want to maybe pick up on some of the points made by Deputy Connolly, and the most important aspect of the report, as far as I'm concerned, is the recognition of Irish Sign Language as a language, and educating ourselves as to what that means. I mean, Clause 4 of the bill moved by Senator Mark Daly last month in the Shannon, to my mind, goes to the heart of this issue. We're talking about a language in its own right. It's not a substitute. It's not a tool for disability. It's not a tool to access public services. If we take that approach, we're going to downgrade the language and we're going to have a poorer outcome for users and future users. So our starting point in the committee report is that ISL is a language in its own right, and lack of access to language creates barriers. And I think that that's a really would be a hugely important step forward if we were to recognise that, because in the past in our society we've had some awful situations. Obviously, many children were abused in the history of our state, but sign language was actually denied and even discouraged to deaf children. We've had stories of deaf children with their hands tied behind their back to force them into stopping signing, as if like you'd be forcing them into a verbal language or something. Absolutely crazy. We were talking to Deputy Shortall on the way over, who was a trained teacher, taught in schools for deaf children, but was prevented from learning sign language because the state discouraged its use. And we have to say that that caused lifelong communication problems for deaf people and their families, and it is a horrible part of our history and one that we should learn from and not repeat, because the learning of sign language, like any other language, really needs to be developed as early as possible. We don't wait for our children to be teenagers or adults before we expose them to the language, and deaf children should be just the same as hearing children are in that regard. I think we should point out that deafness can be something that lasts with people for a lifetime, but it may not. It may be something that people develop in the course of their lives. And very young children who are before school age and older citizens can become deaf. So it's not just about accessing ISL in school or work hours or accessing social welfare. It's really about more a system of accessing, about a language. And I think that is important. I think as hearing people, we have to shift our focus from thinking of deafness as a sort of a medical phenomenon and attempting to sort of understand that there is a culture and a language that we have ignored. And that's what's caused the problem. Nothing else, really. I mean, I thought Lynn Ruane made an incredibly good and relevant contribution in the Shannon debate when she said, when deaf people gather together, say in the deaf village in Cabra, there are no communication barriers. There is no discrimination. It's only when they leave that the setting, that their language then becomes a problem or a disability, because we haven't catered for the inclusion. We make language a disability. And to me, I think that sums it up very, very well. I mean, 80% of deaf adults have a low level of literacy in the English language. And while we do need to obviously achieve higher rates of subtitling and so on television, we have to understand that written English is not the first language of deaf people, and subtitles and all of that is very, very good. But we have to do more than that. And the training and the proper scrutiny of ISL interpreters and their broadened availability is critically important like that. I mean, other deputies have given the examples of the scenarios that our people are left in without language, but even simple things. A situation earlier this year where the Department of Social Protection brought out a new card which could only be activated over the phone, meaning that the deaf person had to give their private information, password details and so on, to a hearing person so that the card could be activated. I mean, it's just a lack of thought and consciousness. Obviously, other points that deputies have made about visiting doctors and so on, involving a third party in your most intimate and private contracts with doctors or whatever, is just completely unacceptable. The very last two quick points I would like to make, Ceann Comhairle, is one is on the subject of the services provided by our national broadcaster. Firstly, the target of providing 2% television shows with ISL interpretation is too low. And it's really actually insultingly low and is indicative of the lack of focus on this. I think the cancellation of the hands-on TV programme, again, is something that the deaf community feel badly about. And I think the use of interpreters on RTE is low. It's late at night. We need to make that more accessible. I just think I would just echo the points that we have a small community here in Ireland, small deaf community, who are in essence living in a world where nobody else speaks their language. Governments haven't invested the amount of money necessary to rectify and change their quality of life. We are going to be given that opportunity in the course of this stall, thanks to the fact that the bill has gone through second stage in the Shannon, and I really hope we won't be wanting this time round.
Thank you.